Hello, and welcome to another episode of Boundless Body Radio. I'm your host, Casey Ruff, and today we have another amazing guest to introduce to you now. Robert Sikes is a returning guest on our show. Be sure to check out his first appearance on Boundless Body Radio on episode 107, entitled Becoming a Savage. I was also fortunate enough to be hosted on his fantastic podcast, the Keto Savage Podcast, back on June 7th, 2021, titled Pivoting, Mindset, and Living a Life Fulfilled. Robert Sikes is a natural ketogenic bodybuilder, podcast host, author, and entrepreneur. He is the CEO and founder of Keto Savage, a health and fitness company that offers coaching, training, and nutrition for athletes and bodybuilders. He is also the CEO and founder of Keto Brick, a company that produces ketogenic meal replacement bars for efficient nutrition with the highest quality ingredients. Sikes holds first-in-class titles from his bodybuilding competitions within the OCB and WNBF federations, and lives in Northwest Arkansas with his wife, Crystal. His latest book, Ketogenic Bodybuilding, A Natural Athlete's Guide to Competitive Savagery, is a culmination of all he has learned through his bodybuilding endeavors and client coaching practice. Robert Sikes, just an absolute honor to welcome you back to Boundless Body Radio.
Hey, man, I'm excited to be here. I appreciate the opportunity.
Absolutely. I really love going back and hearing our episodes before. How we got to interview each other back and forth was super fun. And you have been busy since then. Tell us a little bit about what you have had going on this last year.
Man, I didn't. When did we record the last one? Has it been about a year?
Yeah, it was last spring, June, July, just kind of right in there. Lots happened in your life.
Yeah, so the book's been published. We moved to our new location here, and we've been just rocking and rolling with this. We're starting to get into screen printing, so we're starting to bring out our whole apparel line. We got a baby on the way. That baby will be here in about a month, if not sooner. So lots going on for sure, but all good things, all exciting things.
That's amazing. Tell us about the new facility. We understand you don't have to actually live in the facility like you were doing before.
Yeah. I didn't mind living in the warehouse, but it definitely got old for Crystal. I mean, we lived there for 3 years, which is kind of crazy. But yeah, now we've got the facility, the compound, and then we have our own house, which is like 10 minutes down the road. So much more separation between work life and personal life, home life. But yeah, we get a great setup here. The new compound is like my little piece of paradise. It's twice as big as the 3 buildings that we were leasing together. And yeah, we got a lot of room to grow now for sure.
That's amazing. I just think back to all the stories I've heard of you and Crystal, and like all the work and dedication you put into growing the business. And you were doing stuff out of your kitchen. At one point you were driving hours and hours back and forth to a facility to make, the Keto Brick and keep your business running. This must feel like absolute heaven to have everything more condensed and consolidated.
Oh yeah, for sure, man. Having everything under one roof is definitely the way to go. I feel like we've got so many opportunities at our fingertips, and we've got the ability to dig into them now. So we're excited for what the future holds, without a doubt.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Recently, I was fortunate enough to interview a good mutual friend of ours, Scott Mislinski, on the Carnivore Cast podcast about his journey into bodybuilding, but also, on a carnivore diet and how he was able to mesh those two things. And so since your book just came out recently, I was hoping we could have you on to talk to us, not necessarily about like bodybuilding per se, but how important muscle building is, especially when you're doing a low carbohydrate or ketogenic diet, and some things that people can maybe run into or things that they can help themselves improve and be able to build muscle well on this type of diet. So before we dive into that, I would love to remind the listeners a little bit about your story, how you got interested in first of all, bodybuilding, but also low carbohydrate and ketogenic diets over the years.
Yeah, so I've been bodybuilding for about 15 years now, quite some time. Wow. I've been ketogenic half that time, so about 7 years strictly ketogenic. And I started, doing the traditional bro diet approach to bodybuilding, eating 6 or 7 meals a day, eating every 2 or 3 hours, chicken, rice, broccoli kind of deal. And it worked. I got really lean. I was able to win my competitions, but I developed a bunch of disordered eating tendencies following that protocol. So I knew there had to be a better way. And then I kind of started dabbling into carbohydrate backloading, which is basically ketogenic during the morning and then high glycemic index carbs at night. But I noticed that I felt better in the absence of those carbs at night. So I started doing carb backloading minus the carbs, which lo and behold was ketogenic diet. And this was before there was any information out there about the ketogenic diet. So I started diving into that, felt great, decided that I was going to do a competition in the absence of carbohydrates, earned my pro card status in 2017 with that ketogenic approach. And I pretty much have not looked back since. I've been just going strong keto since then. And I pretty much made it a point of mine to dedicate my life to putting information out there around improving body composition and overall health and wellness and optimal performance via the ketogenic approach.
Yeah, no, that's great. You mentioned a little bit of the Borough Science, and I think all of us have seen people lugging around a small piece of luggage that looks like it could be a carry-on that has all these different compartments for, 17 different meals and all these different supplements and all that kind of stuff.
That was
Tell
me.
us a little bit about, yeah, I'm sure you know all about that. Tell us a little bit about comparing that approach that I think we've all recognized. If we've been around a gym, we see that all the time, and we kind of associate that with, look, if you want to grow muscle, if you want to get a little bit bigger, you need to be eating all the time. You need to be eating all these meals versus kind of the approach that you settled into and what the differences were.
Yeah. So, I mean, back then it just wasn't really conducive to a productive lifestyle. I mean, when you're literally eating 6 or 7 times a day, every 2 or 3 hours, and you're carrying all this stuff with you. I mean, I would literally stop in the middle of a final exam when I was in college, pull out my Tupperware, walk down the hallway, put in the microwave, eat it, and then sometimes not finish my exam because I was allocating this time to eat. But it's like, look, this is the priority in my life right now, is I got to get these meals in. So it's just not really conducive to a productive lifestyle. I mean, you're constantly fixated on when your next meal timing is. Whereas contrast that with what I'm doing now. I mean, I eat 2, sometimes 3 times a day. When my calories are really low, I'll only eat once a day. So I don't just spend my entire day fixating on food. I can eat till I'm, satiated, hit those macros on the head, and then go on about my day. And I'm just much more productive as a father, soon to be father, as a husband, as a businessman. And just, I've got much more freedom to live life and focus on the things that I need to without just constantly focusing on when my next meal is.
Yeah, I found it to be difficult in 2 ways. First of all, I knew that if I wanted to gain muscle, that's what I had to do, was eat those frequent meals all the time before learning that you could do this low carbohydrate and eat way fewer meals every single day, which is amazing and very convenient, like you said. But it was also not just that I had to, it wasn't that I was trying to eat that way, but I almost had to eat that way because I was so hungry all the time. Like if I didn't get that meal between clients, I maybe only had a handful of minutes. And so I was maybe scarfing down whatever food I could get. But because if I didn't get that meal, I would be hangry for sure. Is that something you noticed as well?
Oh yeah, man. I mean, I remember like when I was really tracking things during those days. I mean, I went on a ride with my brother one time and he dipped his hand into my little Ziploc bag full of almonds that I had measured out and set aside, and that I darn near ripped his head off, man. I mean, like you're so protective of your food. Like it's just not any way to live. I mean, it's not healthy. It's not conducive to having proper relationships. Like you just become so fixated on what you're consuming that you're distracted from what else is happening to you in life. Whereas now, when I'm in a prep, I'm hungry, and I'll eat that food and I'll enjoy that food, but my life doesn't revolve around that, which I think is just liberating.
Yeah, that's a really big distinction between those two things. I'm glad you pointed that out. So for somebody who maybe isn't a bodybuilder, they think of a bodybuilder as somebody who has this giant mass of muscle that they don't necessarily want. Why is it still so important to focus on muscle and to build muscle? Why is that important for pretty much everybody across the board?
Yeah. So, I mean, everybody is a bodybuilder, whether they step on stage or not, they are a bodybuilder. They're either building muscle or they're building fat. So everybody can kind of think of themselves as a bodybuilder, and everybody is going to benefit from more lean mass. Like that's going to be conducive to a better resting metabolic rate. That's going to be more conducive to just energy and functioning and having movement and mobility. And I mean, just as you age, if you have very little lean muscle tissue, you're going to become more subject to risk of injury. If you fall when you're in your later years and you have a lot of muscle, you're probably going to recover from that fall much more easily than if you were to be frail and not have any lean tissue to pad against that fall. So I think, muscle is like the longevity organ. I've heard it described that way many times. And I feel like that's a pretty accurate depiction. The more muscle you have, especially as you age, the more fulfilled life you're likely going to have. You're going to have more options to live and go about your day without having to be encumbered by just lack of mobility, honestly.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. I think for most of my career, I kind of thought of the older person taking the fall was more a factor of stability, like a lack of balance and stability. And so I wanted to have that person in the gym, maybe, stand on soft surfaces and practice movements where, they were practicing on unstable surfaces and building up their balance. And I certainly think that there is a place for that, but I do place a lot more importance now than I used to about just developing strength in the muscle fibers. And I think the old person taking the fall is much more a factor of them not being able to fire and recruit enough muscle tissue quickly enough to be able to stop them. Is that something that you understand as well?
Yeah, totally. I mean, you're going to be able to like catch yourself much better if you've got that muscle activation, you've got that lean mass. I mean, your quality of life is going to be exponentially improved if you have lean muscle tissue. I'm not suggesting that everybody go out and try and be stepping on stage. I mean, if you're an 87-year-old grandmother and you're not wanting to probably step on stage, but hey, you want to be able to spend quality time with your grandkids. Having more muscle is going to be able to enable you to do that.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think of the grandma and being able to, prepare meals and to be able to carry trays and do all those things to be able to take care of the family, let alone play with the grandkids and do all those things that I think is so critical. And what everybody says they want as far as longevity, people think they maybe want to live a long life, which is fine, but you also don't want to live a long life where you've had chronic disease for a majority of it. You want to live, not just the health, the lifespan, but also the health span and being healthy. And I agree. I think the muscle mass is so important for that. Can you describe the difference between hypertrophy and absolute strength in muscle?
Yeah. So hypertrophy is basically just building the muscle and causing it to grow. So like as a bodybuilder, my goal is to maximize hypertrophy. So to have more muscle fullness, more muscle tissue, more muscle fibers, and just more size to the muscle tissue. That doesn't necessarily equate to more strength. I mean, oftentimes they're correlated. But for instance, there's a lot of debate as to what the best way is to maximize strength versus muscle hypertrophy. A lot of people compare powerlifting and bodybuilding. So powerlifters are incredibly strong, and they do things to basically shorten the range of motion and limit the amount of space between where the weight sits and where the weight ends up at the end of the range of motion. So you think of like a bench press, for instance, like you see these massive powerlifters that are moving an incredible amount of weight, but they're not actually moving that much range of motion because the way they're formed, the way they position themselves on the bench, the range of motion is not that broad. Whereas you look at a bodybuilder who's trying to maximize muscle hypertrophy, they're basically trying to be as inefficient as possible with that weight throughout the range of motion. You want more blood flow, you want more range of motion, you want more stimulus to the entire muscle belly to force more blood in that muscle, to create more acute stimulus in that muscle to elicit that growth that you're looking for. So basically, if you were to summarize, hypertrophy is building muscle growth, and powerlifting or something that's going to be focused more so on the actual strength.
Yeah, gotcha. So both are very important in the proper context, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And I try to blend them both. I mean, I like lifting heavy weight as a bodybuilder, even though my goal is not so much to be lifting the most weight possible. It's more so to be look like I lift the most weight possible. But I mean, they kind of go hand in hand to an extent. I mean, if you're lifting a lot of weight, you're probably going to have larger muscles as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think we'd like to put those things into a box and say that this is hypertrophy and this is strength, where both can go hand in hand, depending on the protocol, right?
Totally. I mean, the way I structure my personal workouts is I'll kind of have each muscle will be targeted twice during a 8-day cycle, basically. And in those two, sessions for a given muscle, I'm having one heavy day and one hypertrophy day. And on that heavy day, I'm lifting fewer repetitions, but heavier weight. On the hypertrophy day, I'm lifting a little bit more repetitions, but at a slightly lighter weight. So I'm able to lift those more repetitions. I basically kind of cover both ends of the spectrum with that.
Yeah, gotcha. I do want to talk about the content of your book. First of all, I would like to understand why you decided to write this book. It occurs to me that nothing like your book exists out there. This is something that appears really unique, and it looks like it wasn't something you maybe were dreaming of doing or writing a book, but basically like your story with Keto Brick, it was something that you developed because you found a gap in something that could really benefit you. Is that an accurate way to say that?
Yeah, totally, man. I mean, there's a bunch of books out there about bodybuilding. There's a bunch of books out there about keto, but you don't really hear the two kind of intertwined, ketogenic bodybuilding. But I'm passionate about both, so I wanted to kind of write a book that meshed both of those. And there's so many people that are high-level athletes that want to know that they can perform at an elite level in the absence of carbohydrates, and they're trying to avoid those carbs, whether to improve their blood glucose or their relationship with food, whatever the case may be. But to give them a blueprint as to, hey, look, if you're wanting to perform at an elite level, improve your composition in the complete absence of dietary carbohydrates, here you go. This is the way to do it.
Yeah, that's great. Can you tell us some of the misconceptions that people have around, again, not just bodybuilding, but building muscle and being on a ketogenic diet?
Yeah, so a lot of people assume that you can't build muscle in the absence of carbohydrates because they put insulin in such high regard and say, hey, look, you have to have insulin to build muscle. And that's not true. I mean, insulin is an extreme growth agent for sure. But as long as you're taking in enough calories, taking in enough protein, and you're activating muscle protein synthesis via progressive overloading principles and causing there to be enough stimulus to elicit growth, you can build muscle in the complete absence of carbohydrates without a doubt.
So how were you able to kind of discover that? Because that really is the message that we hear all along, especially with maximizing muscle tissue, is yeah, you can maybe get stronger not eating the carbohydrates, but you've been able to really maximize your muscle growth also without eating carbohydrates. Can you tell us a little bit about what that process was like?
Yes. I mean, honestly, for me, I was so my health and my relationship with food was improved so dramatically via the ketogenic diet that I was willing to do that, even if it didn't cause muscular growth, because that alone was worth its while for me. So I've just been doing it for the past 7 years. But over that time, my lean mass has improved, my strength has improved, my muscle shape and symmetry and proportions have all improved. I mean, I've grown more tissue in that time. And it's a long game process, but that's going to be true whether you're following any diet. I mean, natural bodybuilding in and of itself is a very long game process. So, I've been able to just see over the years that my shape and form and function have all, gotten better. So I'm highly motivated to say that, look, I can be the poster child for people that want to know that you can build muscles with a ketogenic diet. And a lot of people, they say, yeah, but you built all your muscle, back when you were eating carbs. I found I dug up a picture from 2015 the other day and compared that to what my last, competition footage looked like, and black and white difference between the amount of muscle that I built in that time. And in that time, it was completely ketogenic, no carbohydrates throughout that entire, several year process. So it's 100% feasible. If you want to go the route of without carbohydrates to perform at an elite level, you absolutely can.
Gotcha. What are some of the downsides to staying on a very low carbohydrate diet when you're trying to build muscle? I mean, right off the bat, it really seems like patience would be one of those things. Like it might take you a little bit longer to go through that process to get to where you want to be, but you'll probably do it in a more healthy way. Like what's your opinion on that?
I mean, I don't really think that if I was to take the last 7 years that I've been ketogenic and had introduced carbohydrates, I don't feel like I would have built much more muscle in that time. I mean, once you've been training for, 5-10 years or more, like your gains year to year are going to be pretty incremental. I mean, you're not going to be able to have those beginner newbie gains that you experienced during your first year of lifting. So any natural bodybuilder, regardless of the diet they follow, they don't have an increase in weight, a significant jump in weight with every year that they compete. I mean, a lot of them will post pictures from, 2 or 3 years when they competed prior, and their weight may have only changed by a few pounds. So, I mean, it's once you've hit that muscle maturity phase, any muscle mass that you build year to year is not going to be, it's going to be more like 1 or 2 or 3 pounds, not like 5, 10 or 15. So, I don't really think that I've left much muscle growth potential on the table by following a ketogenic diet, but throughout that process, I've been able to improve my recovery. I've been able to improve my mobility. I've been able to just have that healthy relationship with food. And I don't have near the swings that I did prior. I mean, I would go into an off season. I'd put on just, 30, 40, 50 pounds in the off season. And it seems like it was much easier to put on unnecessary body fat weight via a carbohydrate heavy diet in the off season. Whereas with a ketogenic approach, my off seasons are much more clean. And I'm able to stay within striking distance of that stage weight much more easily, which I think is a huge benefit, because then I don't have to diet nearly as hard when competition season rolls around. And if I don't have to diet as hard, then I'm not going to risk losing any more lean mass than is necessary.
This doesn't seem like the pendulum would swing quite as far one way or the other. It seems like everything kind of levels out, which is true with low carbohydrate diets and pretty much anybody, especially with like blood sugar issues, either type 1 or type 2 diabetics, I think can really notice that even if you're type 1 and you need insulin to be able to eat whatever food you eat, with a low carbohydrate diet, you can control those swings so much better. So you're not swinging all over the place one way or another. It sounds like it's very much the case with bodybuilding and adding muscle as well.
Yeah, 100%, man. I mean, like right now I'm sitting at about 180 pounds. I competed about 160. So, being within about 20 pounds of a healthy stage weight is like a good sweet spot, because I'm not putting on so much body fat that I've got to diet down so hard, but I'm also not staying, incredibly stage lean, which would possibly mean that I'm not taking in enough calories, being in a surplus, which is going to inhibit my ability to build as much lean mass as possible. So having that healthy transition period between a cutting phase and a building phase is so important, regardless of the diet you follow. But I definitely think via a ketogenic low carb approach, you can kind of hedge your bets and mitigate a lot of those adverse effects.
Yeah, I love that. You just mentioned a lot of the benefits of keeping carbohydrates low in the diet, and all of those are very important, but there's also like so many other health benefits that may or may not be related to building muscle. What about things like you've noticed maybe with your skin or with digestion or other things as far as like overall health? You already mentioned like productivity, like being really productive during the day and getting the things done you need to, mental clarity. Like what can you tell us a little bit about those things you've noticed as well when you're staying very low carbohydrate?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like from a digestion standpoint, this kind of goes without saying, but a lot of people when they're eating quality, clean foods, much less waste going in to their system, much less waste going out. I mean, like there's no gas, there's none of that stuff. I mean, I'm I'm regular, but it's not like obscene like you will with a bunch of crap diet in your, coming in your system. And then I think that's a pretty good indicator of a healthy GI tract, healthy digestive system. And from like what else was going to go with this? From like just a productivity standpoint, like you said earlier, I don't have to fixate on food so much throughout the day. And the meal prep side of it, that's a huge factor as well. Like so many people spend so much time prepping their meals for these 6 or 7 meals a day. And I mean, I don't have to do that. I cook for, actually, I'm going to be lying here. My wife does most of the cooking. But like normally there's 1 or 2 meals a day, and it's just a clean, simple, fresh meal that you don't have to spend hours fixing up, and you don't have to spend near as much time meal prepping, which is also a big benefit. And I feel like via a ketogenic approach compared to other diets, because I'm not putting on near as much fat in the off season, I don't have to do near as much cardio to maintain good cardiovascular health as well. I mean, I was for a while running every single day just because I enjoyed the run, but I'm not doing that currently. But my conditioning stays pretty much the same as it was then. Like I'm not having to, try and burn the candle at both ends from a resistance training standpoint and from a cardiovascular standpoint, because I'm not putting on near as much unwanted bulk and unnecessary body fat.
Yeah, that's interesting. You mentioned a meal prep, and I kind of found the same thing. I was preparing the meal to basically be a waste product of some kind. It was either going to get processed through me and become a waste product and look, about the same as it came out when it went in. But also, so much of what I prepared would end up getting thrown away at the end of the week. Like you just get so sick of that food, and it goes bad so quickly. It would be so many trips to the store, all these hours on a Sunday cooking, missing, outdoors and the things that I love, again, for food that was going to get, wasted one way or another.
Yeah. I mean, I'm a huge advocate for not throwing away any food. Like I literally throw away zero food. I mean, I eat every single thing that we've thought out. Our dog eats whatever we don't eat. But not really, because he's eating pretty much just a carnivore diet as well. So there's not really much waste that he's eating either. So yeah, I mean, I think not contributing to all the waste that's out there. I listened to a podcast a few days ago, and it was like some astronomical statistic. It was like, of all the food in the United States, 49% gets discarded. So literally half of what we produce, we're also just throwing away, which boggles me. I mean, I don't even understand how that's even possible. But yeah, I think not contributing to that massive waste is definitely the direction we should all strive to go.
Yeah, I absolutely love that. You and I talked a bit about minimalism when we talked before, and I think that's so important. It's interesting. I can't quantify this more than just observing, but we take out a recycling can every single week and our garbage can maybe every 3 or 4 weeks. And that was never the case. We would always take those out at about the same time. And I think diet was a big part of that. We just throw food away a lot less, just like you. I do want to define what low carbohydrate is and what that means to you. Is that grams? Is that net or gross carbohydrates? And do you cycle those carbohydrates depending on desired effect during the year where you are with your contest?
I mean, I never really consume more than 20 or 30 grams of total carbs a day. So, I mean, my low carb, it's like, you got some people in the camp that say, hey, look, it's all based off of your blood levels. Like if you're in ketosis, then, you're technically on a low carb diet, no matter how much you eat, as long as you're still in ketosis. For me, like, I don't really eat a lot of foods that would yield a higher carb count anyways. So just by default, my total carb count throughout the day winds up being about 20 grams on the high end, or 30 grams on the high end, 20 grams probably about average. And depending on where I'm at with my calories, that may be even lower, like sub 10 grams total carbs. So yeah, somewhere in that window seems to be pretty much where I wind up falling. Crystal, my wife, who's 8 months pregnant right now, she has never once in her entire pregnancy eaten more than 30 grams of total carbs. And anytime she does, that's just coming from, a handful of blueberries or something like that. So very minuscule amounts of total carbohydrates in our life. Yeah.
That's a really interesting observation too. How was her health going into delivering the baby?
Like 100%, man. I mean, she's like I'm probably a little bit biased because she's my wife and I'm proud of her, but she is like the perfect example of what I feel like a pregnant mother or someone that's about to be pregnant, striving to be pregnant, should strive for with regards to her health. I mean, she was on top of her nutrition for months prior to the pregnancy, taking all of her prenatal vitamins beforehand proactively. She has been totally flawless with it throughout her entire pregnancy. She has continued her training every single day without fail. And I mean, the pregnancy has been super smooth. Like a lot of mothers struggle with cravings during pregnancy, but a lot of that's a result of the massive, surges and drops in blood sugar. So if you start giving into those cravings, it's only going to amplify those cravings. Whereas if you can kind of stay pretty even keel, you'll probably mitigate all those, adverse effects and all those cravings, which will likely yield a bunch of unnecessary weight gain.
Yeah, no, I really love that. I'm glad to hear she's doing so well on that style of diet. I think that's fantastic. And I agree. Just again, based on observation, it seems like you can eliminate a lot of issues that most pregnant people have when they're, heading to birth. So I really appreciate that. And that kind of, that observation from you. So curious to know, should people be cycling carbohydrate at all, or should they keep it all the time low the way that you do? Is there a place for carbohydrate cycling, or really, again, just best to keep it as low as possible?
Yeah, so I don't ever want to become dogmatic or overly zealous in my approach to nutrition to say that this is the way that everybody should do it by any means. I mean, there's a lot of people that can eat relatively high carbohydrates without any adverse effects. I mean, they're healthy, they're metabolically sound, they like the carbohydrates. They would feel deprived if they did not have those carbohydrates. And if it's working for them, they're happy with their composition, they're happy with their health markers. Then I say, more power to them. Eat what you want to eat. But for me, I prefer the way I feel. I prefer the way I form and function in the absence of all those carbohydrates. And I certainly don't think people need to have those carbohydrates to perform at an elite level. So if it resonates more with them to avoid them, I think they're totally fine in doing so.
Yeah, that's great. Let's talk about some of the other macronutrients, especially protein. How important is protein in your diet, and what kind of numbers are you typically targeting for yourself, but also your clients?
Yeah, so protein's super important. Like protein, it's interesting because as the keto space has evolved over the years, I've seen it in which, everybody was avoiding protein for risk of gluconeogenesis, and they assumed that protein would turn into chocolate cake once it entered your bloodstream. Not the case. And now the opposite of the spectrum, the pendulum has swung so far that people are prioritizing protein to the point that they're minimizing fat unnecessarily, and they're basically giving protein this golden halo, and it can do no wrong. You can't overconsume protein is what they're suggesting. As is true with most things, the answer lies somewhere in the middle. You need protein. You absolutely want to have protein to repair and build more muscle tissue. It's incredibly important macronutrient, but not at the expense of enough dietary fat, because that's where you're getting your energy. You can make energy with little dietary fat, little carbohydrates through protein alone via gluconeogenesis, but that shouldn't be your prioritized and your preferred form of energy production, because it's not an efficient process. So it's going to be different for everybody. I mean, one's own personal energy expenditures are going to dictate things. How much muscle they're carrying is going to have an effect. There's a lot of variables at play as to how much protein a person should consume. But a good general rule of thumb for most people is if you're consuming about a gram of protein per pound of lean mass, or 1.5 grams of protein per pound of lean mass, you can certainly get things dialed in and be pretty healthy around that intake.
Okay, so 1.5 grams per pound of lean mass. I love that recommendation. A lot of people would say, wow, that is way too high. You're going to cause damage to the kidneys or the liver, or all kinds of crap that I hear people say about over-consuming protein. How would you respond to that?
There's just not really any literature that suggests that over-consuming protein is going to be damaging to the kidneys, especially if you're taking in enough total calories and enough dietary fat. I mean, if you're 150-pound individual and you're taking in 400 grams of protein, that's unnecessary. That may be damaging, but who in the world would want to consume 400 grams of protein? That's a lot of chicken breast and tilapia, and that's just no fun at all. But if you're consuming about 1 gram per pound of lean mass, 1.5 grams per pound of lean mass, you're active, you're working out, you're hiking, or burning some calories, then yeah, taking in that amount is going to be super healthy, totally within that normal healthy range. It's going to allow you to build muscle and recover. You shouldn't have any issues in that regard.
Yeah, that's great. I've heard you answer this before, and I find this really interesting, and I see a really strong argument on either side. You have shifted from eating several meals a day to eating a few meals a day that are more, more volume. You're eating a lot more when you're eating those meals. People make the argument that you need to get at least 30 to 40 grams of protein, somewhere in that ballpark, to get enough leucine to trigger muscle protein synthesis. And you want to trigger that a lot of times. So that's the argument to say, like, you do want to have, multiple meals in a day, more meals in a day, to be able to get that much protein, to have that trigger, tripped every few hours, to always be in muscle protein synthesis, where, I've heard you talk about this in the past, again, like having, less meals, but having more volume and getting enough protein is totally adequate to be able to achieve that. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so I think I haven't seen any compelling research that suggests that if you don't eat every 3 or 4 hours, that you're leaving much muscle growth potential on the table. If you're consuming enough total dietary protein intake, then you should be totally fine in that regard. I mean, you have to worry so much about hitting that anabolic window that we all feared, way back in the day. I mean, I would literally go crazy if I didn't have a protein shake within 20 minutes of working out, assuming that I was just, all my gains were for naught. That's just
waste of time.
Yeah. It's not the way it works. I mean, if you're taking in enough protein, enough calories, over the course of a 24-hour period, then you should be totally fine in regards to building the muscle, recovering from the training session. So I wouldn't really worry too much in that regard. Again, you want to make sure you're consuming enough protein in that window, but I mean, it takes some time to digest and assimilate those nutrients. So it's not like it's going to be dissipated instantly. I mean, especially if you're following a ketogenic diet, in which case the fat that you're ideally pairing with that protein slows the digestion and the absorption of that fat. So that's also another key factor.
Yeah, I'm glad you pointed that out. The company I used to work with used to make us wear, I remember for some promotional period, like optimized by 45, which basically we were told, like, if you didn't get your shake in within 45 minutes of your workout, it's like we said, it was completely worthless. Yeah. And over the years, you kind of learn like, oh, wait, no, this is just a great way to sell a bunch of protein shakes down in the cafe when people are done with their workouts. Probably not that necessary.
Yeah, really good marketing, though.
Great marketing for sure. So let's talk about the fat. I think this is really, really important. Why is fat so important to include on this diet? Obviously, we need to fuel ourselves with something. So if we're not getting the carbohydrates, we need to find another source. Why is it so important, besides that, to include fat in the diet?
I mean, that's the main pillar right there. Like if you're removing carbs as your primary fuel source, if you're removing the carbohydrates and glucose and switching to fat and ketones, you have to have that fuel coming in from somewhere, even if you have quite a bit of body fat to lose. So this is one mistake I see a lot of people make. If they've got a lot of fat to lose, they just assume that they can cut out all the fat on their plate, even before their body has become efficient at using fat as a primary fuel source. So I always encourage people to not strive to just remove fat entirely, because then they're going to have, it's going to be a hard transition for them from a carb diet to a ketone or a fat-based diet. So that's not going to be boding well for sustainability and smooth transition in the first place. But then also from a hormonal standpoint, dietary fat, not just your stored fat, but dietary fat is going to be incredibly protective against having, a crazy dip in hormone levels. As a natural bodybuilder, when my calories drop, my hormones take a hit by default, regardless of the diet I'm following. But by keeping my dietary fat relatively high throughout that whole period, I'm able to keep my testosterone levels more in check. My leptin and ghrelin hormones aren't skewed as much. There's a lot more protective mechanisms there by having a healthy intake of dietary fat. I mean, every hormone is going to be impacted by dietary fat. Every cell in your body has a layer of fat as the cell casing. I mean, there's so much that comes from ample dietary fat and ample stored fat. So when you start taking that down to an unhealthy level, things are going to start changing for the worse. So don't fear the fat. Don't consume it in excess. If your goal is to make sure your calories are in balance, that is important. I mean, I wouldn't want people to consume endless amounts of tilapia and chicken breast, and I also wouldn't want people to consume endless amounts of butter and MCT oil. There's a healthy median with everything.
Yeah, no, that's great. I'm glad you mentioned that. I'm glad you mentioned hormones. I did want to ask you specifically about that. What did you notice specifically with things like testosterone when you weren't getting enough fat? How were you feeling? How was that manifesting? And was it just adding more fat that helped you feel a lot better?
Oh, for sure, man. I mean, in the past, when I competed with very minimal dietary fats, I mean, like sub 30 grams, I mean, zero libido, zero energy, zero focus, zero everything. I mean, this is why people say you look like a zombie for, those bodybuilders that are walking around the last month prior to the show. By keeping dietary fat high in the context of my last several preps, yeah, I mean, my hormone levels still took a hit because I was in a deficit, but much less so than they had in prior years by, keeping my dietary fat relatively high. Plus, I was able to just have a better quality of life. I mean, libido was non-existent. I was able to still focus and be productive throughout the day. I was able to still, have some mental clarity. And I feel like by simply keeping dietary fat within a healthy range, it really helped protect against that.
Yeah, interesting. I was just working with a client yesterday who's just getting started on a carnivore diet. And we talked specifically about the hormones. And it did seem to him like when he was adding in more fat to his diet, he was feeling a lot better. And he was curious to know about different hormone levels in his body. And I kind of said, you know what, as long as you're getting enough fat, my hunch would be that all of these things would really kind of level out on their own without you needing to do anything really specific or really needing to worry about any of those, in their own context. Is that something you found as well, that the body will self-regulate everything pretty well once you're getting enough fat?
Yeah, once you're getting enough fat, you should be. I mean, it takes time. Like if you're super imbalanced to begin with, it's going to take time. You can't just eat a bunch of butter and expect it to, correct itself overnight. But if you give yourself the right amount of dietary fat and enough time and enough total calories, then yeah, your hormone levels should definitely come back to within a healthy range. A lot of people diet down I mean, honestly, one of the biggest issues I've seen is people chronically under eating, and that's going to have a drastic effect on their hormone levels, their metabolic rates, their psyche. I mean, lots of things. But, being in a healthy caloric intake is also going to be incredibly protective for optimizing hormone health.
Yeah, gotcha. I'm glad you brought that up. Okay, so when we're recommending carbohydrates, fairly easy for the most part. We want to keep them, I would say, like as low as somebody's willing to tolerate. If they can keep them down at a low level, probably better. Protein, definitely some caveats, some things that you already explained how that can change depending on the person, but generally speaking, a gram, maybe more than that per pound of lean body mass, I think is a great recommendation. Fat, I found to be a lot more difficult to hit. What you were describing is like the even point, the break even point of like not too much, not too little. How does somebody know they're on either one of those extremes? They need to either eat more fat or they need to reduce the amount of fat that they're eating.
So it really just depends on their goal. Like if someone's trying to just be at a healthy maintenance level, or they're kind of in a slight surplus trying to build muscle, then a good simple rule of thumb that fits well for most people is just a simple 1-to-1 ratio. So 1 gram of protein per gram of dietary fat. That's going to put their fat ratio around 67 to 70% of their total calories coming from dietary fat, which works really, really well for most people. I'll typically start people at a higher fat ratio if they have not yet become fat adapted, so that we can really improve the efficiency that their body is using fat, both stored fat and dietary fat. And then as I'm finding that individual's unique protein threshold, I'll start dropping fat while simultaneously increasing protein to figure out at what point their body starts responding negatively to that. But for all intents and purposes, anybody that's trying to maintain or be in a sustainable level, a 1-to-1 ratio works really, really well for most people.
And that's 1-to-1 in grams, not in percentages.
Yeah, 1-to-1 in grams for sure. If you were to do it in percentages, it would be a little bit higher protein than would be optimal relative to fat for a fat adapted diet for optimizing, a ketogenic diet. But if you're doing a 1-to-1 with regards to protein grams to fat grams in the context of someone that is adapted already, that's usually a pretty good ratio.
Yeah, that's great. I think with bodybuilding, we all know that there's different phases of training. And again, I would submit that most people who aren't bodybuilders would want to know about all of this stuff, because I think there are phases in most people's year where they want to get a little bit bigger. They want to add some size. They want to add some muscle. They also want to be a little bit leaner. Maybe in the summertime, they're going to a beach and they just feel like aesthetically they want to look a little bit different. And again, I think that most normal people, quote unquote, who aren't bodybuilders really should be aware of that and should know how to change with those phases of training. So I'm wondering if you could explain, like, if somebody's trying to gain weight, specifically lean mass, what that kind of looks like and how they need to adjust when they start to shift over to now we want to cut up a little bit and we want to get a little bit leaner. What is the difference between those two things?
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up, because this is something that it's strange, because I'm a bodybuilder. I compete, I step on stage, I do all these things, and a lot of people don't aspire to do that, which I totally respect and appreciate. However, it's not like I'm a different human. It's like I'm a different species or anything. I mean, the concepts that I use as a bodybuilder are going to be directly applicable to anybody that's just simply wanting to improve their health and conditioning. So there's no need to try and reinvent the wheel there. The concepts that I outline in the book, the concepts that I talk about through all my platforms, it's the same whether you're stepping on stage or not. So basically, anybody is going to benefit from times in a caloric surplus and times in a caloric deficit. You don't want to avoid one indefinitely. Like, you don't want to be constantly in a surplus. You don't want to be constantly in a deficit. You want to spend more time in a surplus than in a deficit, because the act of building more lean tissue it's a long process. It doesn't happen overnight, especially if you're doing so naturally. So ideally, you want to spend more time in a surplus than not. Usually about a 3-to-1 ratio of amount of time spent in a surplus to a deficit works fairly well. But anybody's going to benefit from that. So when you're in a surplus, you're going to prioritize building more tissue. If you are progressively overloading your training, eating the right nutrients, you're ideally going to make that added tissue come from lean mass as opposed to, adipose tissue and body fat. So being in a surplus, doesn't have to be a crazy amount of surplus, but say your maintenance intake is 2,000 calories. If you're taking in 2,400 calories, for instance, while doing progressive overload with your training, while giving your body reason to grow more muscle tissue, then you should be able to see a healthy growth in that muscle tissue. You're going to have some fat that accompanies that, but not so much that it would be unnecessary and unwarranted. And then, transposing that to being in a deficit, basically optimizing your macronutrient ratios, still keeping your training dialed in, because a lot of people make the misunderstanding that if you're wanting to lose body fat, then you need to drastically change your training. Not so much the case. I mean, if you're in a deficit, one of the most protective things you could do to protect yourself against muscle wasting, catabolism, is to continue to train hard and heavy and intensely, because that's going to give the body reason to hold on to that lean mass that you've built thus far. So don't really change your training drastically, but simply go into a deficit, bring the calories down, optimize the macronutrient ratio and distribution based off of what type of diet you're following, and then really prime yourself for losing that body fat, and then do that for a sustainable amount of time, a few months, depending on the goals, and then transition back into a building phase. And ideally, every single time you transition through these building and cutting phases, you're improving your body's starting and stopping position, so that every time you do it, you get better and better and better.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I love how you mentioned, gaining a bit of fat when you're in a gaining, phase, bulking phase, if you will. You may gain a little bit of fat, like you said, but I have noticed, and I'm sure you have as well, it is vastly reduced for somebody that is on a higher carbohydrate versus somebody that's on a lower carbohydrate diet. The idea, the notion that I was always told that you can't gain muscle and lose fat at the same time, I have found anecdotally to be absolutely nonsense. I've seen way too many people gain muscle and lose fat at the same time and feel amazing while they were doing it. Would you agree with that as well?
Yeah, you can absolutely build muscle and lose fat simultaneously. You're not going to optimize for either. Let me be careful how I word this. So if you're in a building phase, you're going to be able to optimize for building more muscle tissue. If you're in a caloric surplus, you're gonna be able to optimize for building more muscle tissue than if you were in a caloric deficit. When you're in a caloric deficit, you're gonna optimize for losing body fat more so than you are for building muscle tissue. So you could do both simultaneously for sure, but you won't really optimize for either, given that circumstance.
Great point. You'll lean more one way than the other, and you kind of need to consider what your top priority is at that time of the year.
Right. Totally. Yeah, you don't need to put on a sloppy amount of weight in the building phase either. And I used to make that mistake. I mean, I'd finish a show and then I'd bulk up to 230 pounds. That's not a good look for me. I'm 5'8", 230 pounds is unnecessary. So that's why I kind of stay within that 20-pound range. And yeah, I've got more body fat on me now in a building phase, but it's still a very healthy amount of body fat I still have. I like the way I look. I'm comfortable in my skin. I don't feel sloppy at all. So there's no need to put on an obscene amount of body fat in a building phase.
Yeah, I love that. That's great. You mentioned that 3-to-1 ratio, which I think is really important. I can see where a lot of people would take that ratio and flip it the other way, where they're trying to spend 3 times the amount of time staying as lean as possible, or like contest prep or photo ready, like all the time, with very little time spent in the bulking phase or calorie surplus. 3-to-1 the opposite way, like you explained, is three times the amount of time with a surplus, feeling really good, giving yourself enough calories, to build, which I think is fantastic. What does that look like for most people? Is that 3 months on, 1 month off? Is that 9 months on, 3 months off? I mean, how does that cycle for a typical person?
Yeah. So like just using myself as an example, and I am going to be kind of on the extreme side being a competitive bodybuilder, but I'll typically, budget about 4 to 6 months worth of time to cut down for a show. And then I'll spend 2 or 3 months reverse dieting to get back to a maintenance. So there's 9 months right there that I'm in a deficit or maintenance intake, not a surplus. That's why I spend 2 or 3 years in a surplus in between shows so that I can actually build some more lean muscle tissue and look better the next time I step on stage. If I was to spend 6 months prepping and then a few months reverse dieting and then only 3 or 4 months in a building phase, I wouldn't look any different the next time I step on stage. In fact, I might even look worse, because you probably will have some muscle wasting in the context of a deficit. So if you're not giving yourself ample time in a surplus, your hormones are out of whack, and you go right back into another dieting phase, you actually run the risk of losing muscle tissue and looking worse and worse and worse with every cycle that you go through.
Yeah, dude, I think that is so critical to point out how much time you take to really truly prepare for a contest, because I see it all the time. People turning around, doing multiple shows within a quarter or 6 months, multiple contests during a year. And it's just like, yeah, you can maybe do well for some of these, but you're going to drive yourself into the ground. It makes sense why you were so bummed out in 2020, where you were preparing for this contest. It's not unlike an Olympic athlete that has like 4 years to prepare for like one event. You only have this one little time that you spend all this time for. And I think it's so cool that you were able to adapt with those challenges, and especially using stoicism to say like, look, this is out of my control. Let's reframe things and build around it. And what you did, you made something that was really challenging and something you were preparing for that was basically taken from you, and you still came out on top and made something amazing from it.
Yeah, man, I appreciate it. That was definitely an exercise in stoicism for sure. I mean, it happened to a lot of people I know. We were all prepping at the same time. I started prepping for that show in November of 2019. So I dieted through Christmas, dieted through Thanksgiving. I'm dialed in. And then literally a week and a half before the show was happening, COVID took everything away. But at the end of the day, like a lot of people lost much more than me. So, I mean, I have to kind of put things into perspective. Like, yeah, I spent a lot of time prepping for the show, but a lot of people, lost their life or lost a lot of time with family. I mean, there's a lot of things that went wrong with the whole COVID pandemic. But, I made the most of it. I control what I could. I tried to be stoic with it all. I had an awesome photo shoot, made the most of that conditioning, and then transitioned into the building phase. And I'm going to be in a building phase until probably the latter half of this year, in which case I'll transition back into a cut and then compete in 2023.
Nice. I love that. That's great. You mentioned reverse dieting. I know you're an absolute expert in reverse dieting. For the listener, can you tell us what that looks like and why that's so important?
Yeah. So reverse dieting is just as it sounds. It's the reverse of dieting. So dieting is typically defined as dropping calories to lose body fat and improve composition. The reverse diet is basically increasing calories to transition back into a healthy maintenance intake, and then eventually a slight surplus to optimize for building more muscle tissue while not putting on any unnecessary body fat. So reverse dieting is incredibly important. I get so many, honestly, middle-aged women, and probably between like 40 and 60. And this happens to everybody. It happens all sexes, all ages, but the range of 40 to 60 in a lot of females that they've been just dieting for the last 10 years of their life or more, and they're taking in, less than 1,200 calories a day. We've got to reverse diet them, slowly increase their calories, build more muscle tissue, improve their metabolic rate before we can have any hope of dropping, body fat in a sustainable, healthy manner. So reverse dieting is super, super important.
Yeah, I love that. What I typically notice with most people is a reverse diet for them looks like I did a contest, or I prepared for the cruise or the wedding or whatever. I go on the cruise and I'm on the seafood diet. I see food, I eat it, and people gain tremendous amounts of weight. So tell us a little bit about how it's different to reverse diet somebody out of that. Does the content of the diet really change from what they were eating before? And how are you able to manage that so that people don't gain, 20 pounds the weekend after whatever event they were preparing for?
Yeah. So when you diet down, your metabolism is incredibly adaptable. Like it down regulates to follow suit as you drop calories. So if you're starting, like I'll just use myself as an example. My maintenance intake is around 3,000 calories. I'll diet down to 1,700 calories over the course of that 4 to 6 month span. When I'm at my leanest, sub 5% body fat, eating around 1,700 calories, my metabolism, my metabolic rate at maintenance is no longer that 3,000 calories that it started with, because it's down regulated. So if I start going and consuming everything in surplus, everything in sight, and I'm taking in 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 calories a day because I've been restricted for so long, then my body's ability to put on more body fat, adipose tissue, is going to be incredibly heightened. So I can't just automatically jump up to a higher caloric intake than what I started at. I can't even go back to what I started at. I've got to slowly increase those calories over the course of several weeks, several months, to minimize the body fat gain, but then slowly ramp up that metabolic rate to follow suit the other direction.
Yeah, it was so interesting. I spent a better part of my career and over a decade using metabolic carts. And so we were able to validate this on people. We could measure heart rate zones, VO2 and all that stuff, and show people where they were optimizing their fat burn versus when they were exercising, but also resting. We could measure that rate, the resting metabolic rate, how many calories you burn to just be yourself and to hang out and to breathe and to think and to have organs that are working and blood pumping and all that stuff requires, really the greatest amount of calories that you burn in a day. Unless you're extremely active, it's going to be, a big part of what you burn. And you could see it all the time. The people that did, chronic dieting, they were limiting their calories all the time, they would have metabolic rates that would come back hundreds of calories lower than what they should have been for somebody their age, height, weight, and gender. And at some point, you almost didn't even need the machine to tell you that. You could just see when somebody's walking in and, you know, they're maybe 35, 40 years old, they're always cold, their hands and feet are cold, they're wearing a jacket in July. You know, maybe they have lean arms and legs, but they're carrying a little bit more belly fat. It's pretty easy and apparent to see that damage that you can do to the metabolic rate and how you can really make that decline in a not so healthy way.
Yeah, that's why I like all these macro calculators that just, you know, you plug in your height, weight, and just a few other random stats. It spits you out a, you know, very formalized version of what your metabolic rate should be, what your maintenance intake should be. But that's not necessarily the case for a lot of these people that have been chronically undereating, or if they have a lot of muscle and they've been training a lot. Like, it's going to be a lot of nuance there. So kind of really tracking things, getting things dialed in, using more extensive testing methods to figure out what your true maintenance intake is and how to manipulate that based off of the goals is going to be super important.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, so far we've talked about, you know, 2 of the 3 main pillars that I would assume would be part of muscle growth. You know, we want to be able to go into the gym and lift heavy weights. We want to have some type of a split that makes sense. It's going to be different for everybody. Some people, maybe that's a total body workout twice a week. Other people, you're hitting the gym every single day and making sure you're not overworking certain muscle groups. Second part is making sure you're taking in, you know, enough protein specifically to be able to build that muscle back up. Kind of those building blocks that the body uses to build up its, you know, structure, if you will. And then the third part we haven't really talked about yet, which is more of the recovery side of things. And I don't think a lot of people realize when they leave the gym, they're in far worse health than when they entered the gym. You know, if we were to look at blood markers, you know, before and after somebody did a lifting session or any kind of workout, they would look horrible after a workout, much worse than before they came into the gym. So explain a little bit about the importance of proper recovery and what things people need to keep in mind when they're trying to recover and actually grow muscle tissue later on after the lifting session.
Yeah, recovery is super important. I mean, you got to have adequate nutrition for proper recovery. You have to fuel the body to recover from what you've taken from it. You have to have adequate sleep. I mean, I used to be terrible at this. I would not sleep nearly enough. I really tried to be more protective of my sleep over the years. Having a baby may change that. But yeah, I think optimizing for sleep is incredibly important to give your body time to recover. And then honestly, just making sure that you're in a parasympathetic state more often than not, especially like as you're consuming your foods. I used to just consume foods when I was in a really rushed, stressed out state. But in the context of a deficit, it's even more important. I mean, your body needs to be able to absorb and assimilate everything that you're giving it. And if you're stressed out and your sympathetic system is running on overload, you're probably not even going to be able to digest and assimilate all the food that you are consuming. So recovery is incredibly important. But honestly, I should probably take a page out of your book on this one, man. I mean, you probably got way better mobility than me. You got the supple leopard behind you. You're sitting cross-legged throughout this entire podcast. Like I made it a point to focus more on recovery and mobility here lately, pretty much like starting this week. So like I'm gonna start doing yoga and stuff in the evenings. I'm really just gonna start working on that because I feel like that is really protective to making this a sustainable sport long-term.
Yeah, well, that's awesome. I wouldn't model your life after mine in any way, but I will probably getting more sleep than you will in the next few weeks, for sure, with the baby on the way.
That's true.
That's awesome. Very well explained. Tell us about the challenge that you did recently. I want to say it's a 4x4x48 challenge.
Yeah.
I think I emailed you back when you sent out your newsletter, which I absolutely love, the 7-set Sunday newsletter. I subscribe to very, very, very few newsletters. I unsubscribe from as many things as possible. And I purposely keep that in my life because I love seeing it. You do a great job with that newsletter. You described what it was like to do the 4x4x48. And I think I told you, I maybe replied to the email and said like, hey man, if I'm not there, just start without me. Like, go ahead and just do this alone. Tell us a little bit about the challenge you just completed.
Yeah, so it was, I guess David Goggins did this to start with it a few years back. I'm not really sure what the inception was, but basically it's 4 miles every 4 hours for 48 hours. So it winds up being 48 total miles. I rounded up and I did 50 because I wanted to have an even number. So I did 2 extra miles in the front end. But yeah, man, I mean, me and Marcus Aurelius Anderson, he came into town and we did it. There's a few trails around my house and we would wake up at whatever hour landed on that 4-hour mark. We started at 6 p.m. on a Friday, and then you're basically waking up every 4 hours thereafter to run your 4 miles. So, I mean, we were waking up at, 10 p.m., 2 a.m., all throughout the night and day, and then just knocking these 4 miles out and just repeat that process, rinse and repeat for 12 legs, basically.
Wow. Logistically, obviously you're kind of in the same place, but running every few hours logistically, were there any challenges or was that pretty well set since you were kind of at the same home base?
So I was doing polyphasic sleep throughout the whole thing. So I'd basically do my run. I'd come back. For the first few legs, I was trying to eat something, but then I just decided that I was going to fast the whole way through. So I pretty much started fasting after about the, I don't know, fourth or fifth leg, I would imagine. So I do my run, come back. I would take a shower, drink some electrolytes, try and lay down for an hour or so, just to get my feet elevated because I got really bad feet. So getting those elevated so that the better circulation, and then I'd just repeat that process. And that was pretty much my protocol throughout the whole thing.
Wow. Any dark demons you had to face or any really difficult challenges through that contest where you thought you may not be able to get through?
No, there was never a point where I was like, man, I'm not gonna make it because I knew. I mean, I had crutches in the garage. I was gonna crutch to it if I had to. Like there's like taking it, like not completing was not an option. But I think having my feet elevated was a game changer. I mean, I've done like a marathon in the past. I've done a 50-mile march. And for me, just simply having a moment where I can get my feet elevated makes all the difference in the world. So the fact that I was able to do that allowed me to, stay pretty solid throughout the whole thing. I mean, I was literally sprinting at the very end. I mean, I was ready to rock and I felt good there towards the end. So yeah, I mean, it's all mental, man. Like those 2 a.m. runs on the second day, when you've just been doing this for, 24 hours already and you're waking up at 2 a.m. to do it again. I mean, that's like, you are sleep deprived, you are hungry, you are all these things, but you just rock and roll, man.
That's amazing. What things did you learn about yourself and why did you think that was important to complete just as a personal thing for yourself?
I just love challenges. I don't love running. I actually hate running. I don't like running at all, but running is a great vehicle for, simply being consistent and putting one foot in front of the other, literally. And if you do that physically, you become aware of how that transcends the sport of running and spills over into everything in your life. Same as bodybuilding. And since I don't compete every single year, kind of like we were talking about earlier, having something like this that yields a similar mental response is really good for me. So doing a challenge like this on a somewhat regular basis is key. I feel like everybody should do it.
That's great. Do you find that you came out of that with that added level of resilience in yourself and confidence in yourself that you can do difficult things?
Oh yeah. I mean, I knew that going into it, but it's always a good reminder to do something like this. And then I was doing it with Marcus throughout the whole thing. So it was cool to, be alongside him, having him suffer, having me suffer. And we both had different charities that we were raising money for. So I was raising money for RODS, which is Racing for Orphans with Down Syndrome. So I was raising money for them. And that kind of puts things into perspective too. Like I've got everything going for me. I've got my health. I don't have Down syndrome. I'm not an orphan. You start thinking about these kids that are, and it's like, shoot, they've got it much harder than I do, even though I'm sleep deprived and hungry and my feet are hurting. So it just kind of puts it into perspective, and it makes your momentary suffering in time not seem like a big deal at all.
Yeah, no, I absolutely love that. And I think it's so important to include those types of challenges in our lives just to remind ourselves of how strong and resilient we can be so that when the times come around, like a pandemic, that we actually need to draw upon that strength and resiliency that's already been made and created. And we can use that to get through harder times that are completely outside of our control, which is amazing. Love your book, man. You did such a great job with it. What is one simple tip that you would like somebody to take away from your book or from this conversation that they can apply in their lives?
Oh man, so many things. I mean, my whole ethos with my business, with my bodybuilding endeavor, with what I'm going to do with parenting, with my relationship, it's all about playing the long game, being disciplined, being dedicated, being consistent. And I feel like bodybuilding is the epitome of that. Like business is the epitome of that. So if anybody can listen to anything I ever say, I hope they take from it that the importance of simply putting in the work every single damn day that passes, no matter what, is absolutely paramount. So if anybody's taking anything, let it be that.
Yeah, no, I absolutely love that. And as we've done this for more and more years, the value of that really starts to shine through. Like when you take somebody who's put in all the time and effort and they've done the study, they have listened to the podcasts and the books, they've tried it with their clients, even things like podcasting, when we first started out with podcasting, I'm sure you were the same way. You put it out, hardly anybody listens. And so many people quit at that point because people aren't listening. They're not getting that feedback immediately. You're not doing anything to build those habits over time, where if you put in that time and effort, these things grow and build over time. And now we love it when a new gym opens up or there's a new personal trainer in the neighborhood, because we know people are going to go and see them and they're not going to get the same level of quality and care and knowledge that they would if they were training with us. And that only comes from dedicating your life to a certain thing and being as good as possible at that one thing. And I think you're such a great example of that, of, deciding what you wanted to focus on, making it your life passion, not having a plan B for things like Keto Brick. Like, you were going in head first and there was no way you were going to fail and have a plan B with that. And I think it's such an amazing example to the rest of us, and something that's very, very inspiring. And you can see like such benefit of playing that long game. Like you described, you're not in this for the short term. You're not in this to make a buck and get out of it. This is something that you have created over time, thoughtfully, mindfully, that is culminated in this amazing book. And I think it's a wonderful example and a wonderful piece of advice. So I really appreciate that.
Yeah, man, I appreciate the kind words. I mean, before any of this even happened, I just sat down one day and it's like, look, if I was to reverse engineer my life, what would I want my day-to-day look like? And it's honestly pretty similar to how it looks right now. And I love every single day that passes. I'm not doing it for the money. I'm just passionate about the lifestyle, passionate about the people that I interact with daily, passionate about the conversations I get to have with people like you, man. So thank you for putting out what you do. And thank you for the opportunity to chat with you yet again.
Savage. I absolutely love it. Tell our listeners where they can go to find you and connect with you and your work.
Yeah. So Keto Savage, everything online, ketosavage.com, Keto Savage on social, and then ketobrick.com, Keto Brick for the bricks. And actually the book, I built a separate website out for that. It's ketogenicbodybuilding.com. And if people go through that link to get, it's on Amazon and everything too, but on the ketogenicbodybuilding.com, I made a download, like a spreadsheet download that I basically use for my clients, and anybody's free to download that and use it as well.
That's amazing. What a great resource. We will link to all of that in the show notes. Robert, it's always a pleasure to talk with you. I always get really inspired. I think this is going to be a really valuable resource for people that want to be able to build muscle and to also maximize their health, and to do it in a way that they can do it for a very long time for the rest of their life. So thank you so very much for all that you do, all of your content. Best of luck to you and Crystal with the baby coming up. I know you guys are going to be amazing parents. I can't wait to see that journey. And thank you so very much for taking the time out of your day to talk with us today. We always really appreciate it.
Hey, thank you, brother. I really appreciate you, man. Have a good one, and keep in touch, brother.
Absolutely. And this has been another episode of Boundless Body Radio.